Good morning, everyone. We're now moving on to our next vital discussion from deterrence to disarmament, the path forward. My name is Chie Sunada. I'm from Soka Gakkai International, SGI, and we're very honored to co-organize this event with Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. And thank you very much for joining us today. I will be the moderating this panel. Some of you may participated the third meeting of State Party to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the 3MSP to TPNW in short, at the UN last week. That meeting concluded with a significant political declaration amidst the challenging international security landscape, asserting, quote, nuclear deterrence is posited on the very existence of nuclear risk which threaten the survival of all. The TPNW state parties and the civil society played a pivotal role in changing and shifting the discourse from nuclear deterrence to disarmament and abolition. However, we observe a concerning trend at the 3MSP. While among the so-called nuclear umbrella state, only Australia attended as an observer. Belgium, Germany, and Norway, who previously participated, didn't this time. Conversely, some nuclear weapon states are expanding their arsenals and trying to expand their nuclear umbrella and escalating the role of nuclear weapons in their national security strategies. That reveals the widening gap in perspective on nuclear deterrence. Our panel, from deterrence to disarmament, the path forward, aims to explore solutions. And I believe it is crucial that we will foster productive dialogue and bridge the divide between TPNW states and these relying on nuclear deterrence. And I'm very keen to learn from all the experts today. Thank you very much. And I have asked two things to the panelists. One is the language. Youth participation is absolutely vital in a nuclear disarmament, but I learned that language is a barrier that face. So, as we move forward, let's strive to use language that is clear and accessible to everyone. And the second point is hope. Today's symposium theme is Choose Hope. In the spirit, I'd like to encourage our panelists to weave in element of hope in their remarks. I know this sounds very simple and easy request, but it is very challenging, I think. So I really do appreciate your cooperation. Following the panelists' presentation or remarks, we will move on to the discussion among the panelists, and finally, we will open to the floor for the Q&A. So I encourage and appreciate your engagement and dialogue with us. Having all said, please join me in warmly welcoming our distinguished panelists. First panelist is John Mecklin. John has been a journalist focused on the public interest in 40 years. Right now, he is editor-in-chief of Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, an international non-profit organization that sets the doomsday clock, and published a widely read magazine that features the world-leading experts on nuclear weapons and climate change, artificial intelligence, and other major global threats. And he lives here in Santa Barbara. Is that right? Thank you so much. And then next panelist is Ambassador Elayne Whyte. Ambassador Whyte is a diplomat, academic, and a policymaker. She was the Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs of Costa Rica and served as ambassador and the permanent representative of Costa Rica to the United Nations in Geneva. In 2017, she was the president of United Nations Conference that negotiated and adopted the TPNW. She is currently a professor of practice at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. The third panelist is Eduardo Sánchez, He is in charge of disarmament and non-proliferation at the Permanent Mission of Mexico to the UN. He has participated in the Mexican delegation to the TPNW's second and third meeting of state parties. And last and not least, Professor Alexander Harang. Professor Harang specialized in Ikeda's peace philosophy at the Soka University of America, SUA. He also is a senior research fellow for nuclear disarmament at Soka Institute for Global Solution. He also serves as a senior peace researcher at the Ikeda Center for Peace Learning and Dialogue in Boston. So I'd like to invite our first panelist, John. Thank you very much for joining. The doomsday clock is what's set at the 89 seconds at midnight, and that is closest to the midnight in 78-year history. So could you explain the factor and the background, and then hopefully share your thought on how we can move the clock backward? Now the floor is now open for you.
Thanks for the fine introduction. Is this on? Is this hearable out there? Yeah, the doomsday clock moved 1 second closer to midnight in January, and the question that came up immediately was, isn't 1 second kind of a small move? But in the view of the people who set the clock, my board of experts, called the Science and Security Board, that 1 second is enormous. This is the closest to essentially the end of the world that these, I think it's 18 experts now, decided to move the clock. And the clocks, for those of you who aren't that familiar with it, is a fascinating symbol. It was created in 1947, a couple of years after the Bulletin was founded by Einstein and Oppenheimer and some other top people from the Manhattan Project. And at first, they decided to make the Bulletin into a magazine. That was the new media thing at the time. And so they needed a cover for the magazine. One of the engineers had a wife who was an artist, and she came up with a clock with the hand ticking towards midnight to, sort of symbolize what would happen if nuclear war came. And she set it at 7 minutes to midnight because someone asked her later, she says, well, that's what it looked good. And it stayed there for 2 years. It was not designed to move. It's just in 1949 when the Soviet Union tested its first nuclear weapons, the editor at the time went, just got, well, that's horrible. That's the start of an arms race, the start of a Cold War. And so he, on his own, just moved the hands closer to midnight. And that had such a profound effect that so much of the public responded to it that he periodically, when other big events happened, he would change the hands on the clock. And that editor's name, Eugene Rabinowitz, was very, very esteemed in the anti-nuclear and peace realm. So as the editor of the Bulletin, he just set the time until he died in the early 1970s. And since then, various bulletin boards have taken over that responsibility. And now our Science and Security Board pretty much works on this throughout the whole year. They have a meeting in June where they review where the world is, and then another one in November where they actually decide, what the time should be. And it's, as I tell people, it's sitting in those meetings, it's like the best grad school I ever had. I mean, it's, the 15 or 20 of the top experts in the world very seriously presenting what's happening in the various global threat areas, and then trying to come up with, they're all serious policy and science experts, and that's their realm, except they're dealing with this metaphor for the end of the world, right? And they have to figure out, well, what are we going to do with a metaphor, right? And this year, they decided to move it 1 second closer. In the nuclear realm, it was based on 4 or 5 factors. First was the Ukraine war and the chance for escalation there. On top of that, you have the Middle East with Iran and Israel sort of at loggerheads, the chances for that to escalate, and obviously Israel has nuclear weapons to become a nuclear conflagration. The continued, I hate to use this word, but they use it, nuclear modernization programs around the world, which are really a form of nuclear arms race. All the major nuclear countries around the world are spending vast fortunes to make their arsenals more accurate, more deadly, quicker, get there faster. That process, aside from just draining trillions of dollars from world economies, is really, I mean, last night people were using the word insane, and it is when you think about it, to build more, better, really expensive equipment that cannot be used unless, if you do use it, it will mean the end of the world, is sort of a definition of insane. And then in the nuclear realm, there's also the potential for proliferation, because the arms control process has essentially collapsed, and the United States has become increasingly unreliable. Countries around the world are now, that maybe wouldn't have, now are looking at creating nuclear arsenals. And there are countries that could do that fairly quickly. I mean, Iran has been mentioned. It's, weeks or at most months away from building one if it wanted to build a nuclear weapon. But on top of that, I mean, people don't really think of South Korea or Japan or even Germany as new nuclear powers, but all of them have the scientific expertise and the access to the materials to do that if they decided to. And with the strange goings-on in the current White House, those countries that maybe wouldn't have before maybe will. So those areas were all important in my board's decision to move the clock 1 second closer. Of course, we also deal with other existential threats, so climate change and, biological threats also play in there, and a whole host of what we call disruptive threats or emerging technological threats, artificial intelligence, particularly the joining of artificial intelligence into war making, the use of it in battle planning and battle control, and increasingly it is being incorporated into nuclear command and control, which my board finds especially dangerous. And sort of not a last, but 2 final factors is there's, in addition to this modernization race, there's sort of a new space race. Everyone had thought decades ago with the Outer Space Treaty that everybody had decided we weren't going to take nuclear warfighting into space because it has such obvious problematic results if you do that. But now Russia, China, the United States, even India are developing anti-satellite weapons. There's talk of Russia thinking about putting a nuclear warhead in orbit, which is specifically outlawed by the Outer Space Treaty, but still there's serious talk about that. So that threat played heavily, the space threat, into their thinking. And then something that you wouldn't think is a major threat. You know, it's not on the lines of the nuclear threat or whatever, but all of these threats are increased by the corruption of our information ecosphere, the disinformation that, you know, just overwhelms the internet, makes dealing with these really serious problems extremely hard, even for well-intentioned governments. And for not well-intentioned governments, it's a way to just scramble the playing board. So nobody knows what's true, nobody knows what's false. You know, up is down, down is up, and in that atmosphere, it's all but impossible to have serious discussions that the public pays attention to about these serious threats. And that is, from the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist's point of view, that is my main challenge, is to put out accessible, factual, believable information that cuts through the nonsense that pervades the internet. And coming up with the strategies to do that is difficult, but we're working on it. And so I think that's sort of the general what was considered in moving the hand 1 second closer to midnight. Before I quit, I'll just throw in a couple of interesting sidelights. We don't usually talk about what happens in the room when we decide the time on the clock, but this time there was a debate between moving it 1 second closer to midnight, which would be 89 seconds to midnight, or 2 seconds, which would be 88 seconds to midnight. And a real consideration in making it not 88 is that neo-Nazis use 88 as a shorthand for Heil Hitler. So we decided 88 would be a bad number to choose because we'd have to be explaining that. And just as you asked for hope, right? My final note of hope is that this year, 500,000 people read about the doomsday clock on our website within a week of the announcement. More than 4.5 million people viewed the announcement on social media videos. 5 million people read about it on social media. So getting the message out to a large number of people, I think the doomsday clock is establishing itself as one little piece, but a piece of waking up the world to the possibility that we can change things and be hopeful about a future. And I'll quit with that. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much for the remarkable remarks. I didn't know how the doomsday clock started. It was just the illustration, but now it's playing the very important, like a metaphor, how we're facing the challenging. And then, thank you very much, include the hope in the end of your remarks. Thank you very much. And then next panelist will be the ambassador. Ambassador, you were the president of UN conference that negotiated and then adopted the TPNW. Would you like to share how it was achieved? Everyone said that, everyone agrees that without your leadership, that was not possible. Thank you very much for your effort. Please join me to applause. Yeah, so we are curious, how it was, discussed and how it was achieved. Then, would you like to explain what is the significance of the TPNW? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Good morning to all. I'm really delighted to be here with all of you and to be able to share a little bit of that experience that really shaped my life as well as many other lives, including, and very specifically, I would like to mention the life of the Ibakusha and the communities that have been affected throughout the world by nuclear testing, how this process really shaped so many lives. And I really feel privileged to have had the opportunity to facilitate that process. How it was achieved? Well, I will start with the mandate, and then I will answer the second part of the question. The mandate to negotiate a legal prohibition of nuclear weapons was adopted by the General Assembly in December of 2016. The mandate was very straightforward: negotiate a legally binding instrument, and that means a treaty that prohibits nuclear weapons and that creates a path for nuclear weapon states or for nuclear disarmament to happen also within this treaty. So I would like to make a reference, initial reference to the concept of nuclear disarmament, because this is very important. Because you usually hear, especially when you go to capitals of nuclear weapon states, you find out that the discussion doesn't include what I call the D word, the word disarmament. You hear about non-proliferation, about strategic stability, arms control in general, but the D word, it doesn't show up that often. And for the rest of the world, the concept of nuclear disarmament is fundamental. And it is part of the global conversation about nuclear weapons. We consider obviously non-proliferation, arms control, but also nuclear disarmament. And I think that this year, 2025, is really key to understanding why we are talking about hope today. We have some commemorations that would indicate the historic importance of this treaty. So not to go very far, here in this state, 80 years ago, the city of San Francisco was starting the preparations to host around 800 delegates that negotiated the United Nations Charter. They met between April and June. The charter, the United Nations Charter, was adopted in June of 1945. And as we know, that generation had a very important lesson from, not only from the Second War, but also that generation had endured the First World War, pandemic, Great Depression, and Second War. They had one lesson they learned that you can see very clearly stated in the very first paragraph of the preamble of the UN Charter, which is that peace is not achieved through the strength of arms. Peace is achieved by building a world ruled by norms, values, institutions, by the respect of international obligations, and by addressing the root causes of conflict. And that is why you see in the very first paragraph of the preamble a reference to social justice, both at the national and international level, and the respect for human rights. So the charter, when the 800 delegates were engaged in their negotiations in San Francisco, there was perhaps in the environment some thought and speculation about the possibility of an atomic bomb. But they concluded their negotiations in June, and we know that the Trinity test was in July, the explosions in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August. So in reality, the drafters of the UN Charter did not know the reality of nuclear weapons. So it comes as no surprise that between June and the end of the year when the Charter entered into force, the whole world learned about nuclear weapons, and the whole world learned about the explosions in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And they were in horror, obviously, of this new dangerous and incredibly destructive weapon. It is no surprise then that the very first time the United Nations met in London, the first General Assembly in London in January of 1946, actually adopted the very first decision was leading to the concept of disarmament, of nuclear disarmament. That same year, actually, we had other very important milestones. The movement of the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement also started to express the call for a regulation of nuclear weapons in international law, and also the scientists created, also Einstein actually created the emergency committee of atomic scientists, precisely because they believed that when dealing with nuclear weapons, the only control was only going to be possible through citizen awareness. We are going to see how all these elements came together in 2017. Also with the empowerment of civil society, the empowerment of the survivors of atomic explosions and the use of nuclear weapons and testing, by the technological revolution and transport and globalization and all that huge possibility was opened to the world to connect people in the 90s and early 2000s. So that brings me to 2017 again, and these references that I made are very much reflected in the mandate by the General Assembly. Why? Because the General Assembly requested that the negotiations had to be inclusive, and that meant to be open beyond the nation states, the national delegations, to be open to international organizations, and most importantly, to civil society, which obviously in that category we include scientists, scholars, activists, and survivors, etc. That we had to negotiate with the sense of urgency, and also that the treaty needed to imply or generate a reinforcement of the already existing norms of non-proliferation and basically of disarmament. Now I'm going to bring myself into the picture and say, so you know that I am a diplomat, and you know that especially in small nations, we diplomats cannot be devoted to one single topic throughout our lives. So we have to move from different topics. And I had obviously been engaged in different negotiations before regarding security and regional integration and trade and many other aspects, human rights especially. But I became close, I got in touch with this process, and immediately I realized that this process was different. And I used to say that I was very well surprised because this process had a very important combination of reason and conviction. So the negotiations were very successful, first and foremost because of the inclusiveness of the process and because it was a true collective endeavor, although you are very kind in referring these very kind words to the work that I did. But having the survivors in the room with us every single day in the negotiations somewhat changed the normal diplomatic exchange, because we diplomats, we have instructions and we have to fight for our instructions, and then we need to prove our capitals that we were very skillful in promoting whatever we needed to promote as national positions. So you did find from the beginning more flexibility and more openness from the delegations to accommodate to a collective process of learning and a collective process of decision making of how we were going to achieve the treaty. So the inclusiveness was definitely a determining factor that did have an impact on the normal business as usual of diplomatic negotiations. And obviously the inclusiveness brought the ethical compass also, this very, very strong ethical compass and sense of justice and historic justice that this treaty also needed to meet. I need to say, because why not, there is also, this process is also very much shaped by women leadership. I have to say it, I cannot not say it. So not only because the president of the conference was a woman, also the representative of the institutional framework, the representative of the Secretary General was also a woman, and she was a very important force, obviously, in our dialogue. And Mrs. Umi Nakamitsu, who is the High Representative of Disarmament Affairs, she had a very honest dialogue with us and with the conference as well. Many delegations were led by women, and there were many strong voices in the room shaping the narrative and shaping the understanding of what we were doing. And obviously, the articulation of civil society was in the hands of women as well. So I just want to point that out, and just so that you take note of it. But it is a lesson that I think we should also learn. Last but not least, I'm just super synthesizing. We also benefited from a procedural, what I call a procedural element, which is that, well, two procedural elements. First and foremost, that the minds that strategized this process that actually was led by a coalition of, as we know, civil society, but also a coalition of middle powers and small nations. From Latin America, Brazil and Mexico. From Europe, we had Ireland and Austria. And from Africa, South Africa and Nigeria. And the strategy that they had envisioned was that this process needed to be conducted within the framework of the rules of procedure of the General Assembly. That means the process was going to be open, but decisions could be reached by majority. No consensus, no veto, no block. So the process was going to be open to all and blockable by none. So the possibility of adopting a decision by majority was fundamental, and then you saw how this big majority of 122 nations was present the day that the treaty was adopted, in a very, very strong message to the rest of the world. In addition to that, this is, I know that you asked us not to be very specific about UN language and procedures, but this is something that's very important that I would like to also share, because many negotiations start with a draft text. We did not start with a draft text. And it was very interesting because before we got to the negotiation, everybody was wondering, where's the text? Where's the BAM treaty? They used to ask me, where is it? Who wrote it? And they couldn't believe me that nobody had written it. Nobody gave me, as the president, a draft. Nobody. This was very honest. It was a very honest process by the leaders and by the core group. I was not giving any document. It was, so the negotiation process started with a discussion that opened the floor for everybody to say what they wanted to achieve in each of the components of the treaty, the preamble, the prohibition, the positive obligations, everything was open for everybody to give their inputs. So obviously with those inputs, we were able to start building a treaty, different drafts that went on progressing as long as we went on reading and reviewing the different versions. So this is very important because at the end, we all felt that this text was the process of collective learning, of discussion, or of effort. that is fundamental of collective construction. So this is really fundamental. What was the second question? I forgot.
Significance of the TPNW itself.
So yes, I think I already somewhat addressed the issue that, well, in reality, despite the very important steps in 1946, for instance, to a call to regulate nuclear weapons, a decision by the United Nations to go for nuclear disarmament. I think, I am going to speculate, but I think that if the drafters of the UN Charter, if the negotiations of the UN Charter had taken place after August of 1945, the UN Charter would have built not only on 3 pillars. We will have security, development, and human rights. I am totally positive that it would have been another pillar dealing with the issue of nuclear weapons. I am totally positive about that. So after the positive development of 1946 that reflected the concern of the international community about the impact, the advent of the Cold War actually shifted the focus of the conversation towards great power politics, nuclear deterrence, strategic stability, and war scenarios. And but that didn't mean that the rest of the world, of the actors, stopped working. The survivors, diplomats, they continued working and reflecting about how to address the issue of nuclear weapons, how to understand the impacts, and how to document the evidence. And I would fast forward to the 80s when the scientific community generated this report, this study about the impact of nuclear war that led to the concept of nuclear winter. And this is very important in talking about hope, because those scientists, they did their work in the when the tensions of the Cold War were at the highest, and they were ready when an opportunity came to actually brief world leaders, President Reagan and Secretary Gorbachev. They briefed them personally on the findings of the research. So when both Reagan and Gorbachev sat in Helsinki, in Reykjavik, in '86, they already had this information about the humanitarian and environmental consequences of a nuclear war. And their decisions also were basically reflecting that knowledge. So this is the reason why I think we just have to keep on doing our homework in preparing, in discussing. One of the aspects that actually was addressed in this summit in Reykjavik, that was both leaders almost came to an agreement to abolish the nuclear arsenals in a decade. And one of the questions that we have today, we have already around 13,000 nuclear weapons today, of a completely different dimension of the ones that were used in 1945. But if we saw a decision today, because actually we even hear President Trump talking about his interest in generating some progress in nuclear disarmament. Let us think for a moment if there were a political moment in which they decided, world leaders decided, the nuclear weapons state decided, okay, so we are going to abolish nuclear weapons. How long does it take? How long does it take to have a world free of nuclear weapons? Like in specific technical considerations. We, at the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, we had that discussion at the first meeting of state parties, and we asked the scientists to help us understand how long we actually need to be serious in addressing the process of nuclear disarmament. And a group of scientists led by the scientists at Princeton University, they reviewed the historic evidence of precisely of the nuclear of the dismantling of arsenals of nuclear weapons, and they realized that according to those records, it is perfectly possible that in a decade we could have a complete dismantling of all the nuclear arsenals that we have today. There is no other place where this discussion is actually happening. There is no other place where the discussion of victim assistance and environmental remediation is actually happening. Well, now there is a discussion at the General Assembly, but it was started in the process of the TPNW. So there are two takeaways that I think I would like to leave with all of you today. We just have to keep on doing the homework, because we don't know when there is going to be an opportunity, just like there was in 1986, in which we saw this milestone meeting in which the two superpowers actually addressed the possibility of abolishing nuclear weapons. We have to be there, we have to be ready, we have to keep on doing the homework, and also we have to keep on reinforcing this positive dialogue and joint effort between diplomacy, civil society, civil engagement, and scientific work to call the attention of the policy leaders and to let them know of the concern that is expressed in the figures that you were mentioning about how people are actually looking at the possibility of nuclear war today, and to be able to convey this message to the policy leaders, to take into consideration the concerns and the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons and any detonation of a nuclear weapon.
Thank you. Thank you very much for sharing the inclusive process towards the TPNW and then sharing your takeaway. So we need to keep working, and then your emphasis on a dialogue. Thank you very much. The next panelist is Eduardo Sánchez. You are, what is in considering the current nuclear weapon texture, what are the challenges and hope that we're facing? And you also attended the third MSP. So what was your thought, and what was your takeaway from the conference?
Thank you. First of all, good morning to everybody, and thank you for having me. It's great to be able to share this panel and especially talk about the TPNW. Not only, as the ambassador said, that for us diplomats we have to work on what we've been assigned to, but in this case I have a personal conviction also for nuclear disarmament, so it makes it easier for me to work on these issues and be passionate about them. So now that we have a TPNW, with all of the complexities that that requires to be able to negotiate a major treaty at the United Nations with so many member states, but also civil society and other actors, I think that the next added challenge is what to do when you have that treaty. It's rather easy with all the complexities and everything that comes to it. Once you have that text, you say, okay, it's closed, but how do you implement it and make sure that it really addresses the issues? And especially right now, the TPNW, how does it fit in a world where the collective security system is under threats, is being eroded, and what does this mean for an eventual collapse of others if the TPNW is the one to survive amongst this collapse? So once you have these meetings of states parties, you have the treaty, and then the implementation of the treaty is having meetings of states parties with all that have signed and ratified come together, and then eventually a review conference, and then it's a cycle. So it seems very repetitive, that there's not much that you can really think about that, and how do you give content to the implementation of the treaty. Sometimes it becomes especially technical, but we think that to be able to get out the message across and not just inside the UN room, that we need to make whatever we're doing practical for people to understand and to know why we have opted for the TPNW. One of the main points that at least Mexico has been vouching for is to make it more human. This treaty is humanitarian in essence, but we need to make sure that the messaging allows us to connect among humans to understand what nuclear weapons would do to other humans. It's very easy to talk about deterrence and these high-level concepts, but we rarely hear the nuclear weapon states talk about what would happen to the people if nuclear weapons are used, or what deterrence means in practice. Deterrence means killing thousands of people or potentially millions of people. That is never spoken about, except in the TPNW. So it's changing the conversation in that regard. The TPNW is also benefiting from having a scientific advisory group. It is the first time that a multilateral disarmament treaty in the world has that specific group of scientists working on that. So it's a progressive step forward. So we're not only talking about in human terms, but also in scientific terms. Rather, again, than talking about policy and doctrine, we're talking about what the science behind nuclear weapons use would be or is, because we have evidence on that. So the TPNW is extremely progressive, and I think that we also need to capitalize on this. It includes civil society almost on par with governments, which is something that rarely happens. And this has allowed for a different conversation, to be able to listen to the people, those that have been affected, but also those that are potentially affected, not directly by the use of nuclear weapons, but what if it's used, we will all be affected. So having these different perspectives. It's also very progressive because it has a gender lens, which I think is something that we're missing in the security realm. It's always dominated by masculinities and all of these power constructs. So having at least a gender lens built into the treaty allows for a different kind of conversation. But this is a brand new treaty. And no treaty is perfect, even though the ambassador worked very hard on getting the text right. It's a give and take between governments. Sometimes you're fighting over words, over a comma, and that's the end result. But you don't strive to be perfect. You strive to have a framework. So the idea is now how to make that framework actionable and to correct anything along the way that might have been there. So those discussions sometimes become technical, but at times we want to make sure that we're grounding it in reality. So the meetings of states parties between the second one and the third one have had thematic panels where we've focused on very specific questions and to be able to have experts come and talk to us about those. So it's not just a diplomatic talk amongst us or something that has to be completely high level, but we've also had the testimonies directly from those affected by use and testing of nuclear weapons, which is something that had never happened before at the UN at a formal meeting. So we've also been making history with those maybe tiny steps, but I think very important ones. So as you see, the TPNW might seem a little bit boring from the outside, just having speeches here and there, but sometimes those little changes and to be able to have those smaller conversations is something that we've not seen before in the security architecture. So this is also complementing whatever was missing from before. So fast forward to the third meeting of states parties. One of the main outcomes is a political declaration. So different treaties and different processes have different outcomes. It can be, action plans or different products that serve for the moment. In the case of the TPNW, we've wanted to make sure that we don't get too concentrated in just negotiations or stale talk that doesn't get us to anywhere. We want to send powerful messages to the outside world also common messaging that will help us in our daily interactions. So if you go into the website of the treaty, you will see that the first meeting of states parties, the second and the third have very powerful political declarations. And this last one has tried to be as reactive as possible to the world that we're seeing. So between the second meeting of states parties, which was in 2023, to now, we've seen a complete reversal of many of the trends, and nuclear deterrence being even more prominent, but also the way in which is trivialized the use of nuclear weapons, that it's so easy just to say, well, we should have nuclear weapons for our defense, and no problem about that. So we've tried to really react to what the TPNW community thinks about deterrence, but not just talk about it in again, high political terms. Like, what does this mean for our own security? Just the example of Mexico. We are a country that renounced nuclear weapons from the 60s, even before the NPT. We created a nuclear weapon-free zone in Latin America. We gave up sovereignly the idea of nuclear weapons. But we are next to the second largest arsenal in the world. We're sitting next to the country that used nuclear weapons actively, and a country that some time ago took half of our territory. So our security is always in question. It's right now, you probably, or maybe I would say before 2025, probably you wouldn't think about us being as endangered. I think that maybe in 2025, many things have shifted. So what does this mean for countries when their security is threatened and the conversation is only shifted to those that have nuclear alliances or nuclear arsenals? So it's bringing, again, that new element into the conversation. And I think that some of those messages are very powerful there. We also see, as I said, trends that are being reversed from the Cold War. At least during the height of the Cold War, there were talks amongst the nuclear states. They were concerned about arms control. They were concerned about creating treaties. Now we don't see that. Now it's less talk, more confrontation, more preparedness for war, less idea of new treaties. And this is why the TPNW fits perfectly in that vacuum of the great powers not trying to go into that. It's also reflective of other developments like the doomsday clock. There's a reference there being concerned that now it's ticking closer to midnight. And what does this mean for the entire community? So again, trying to use what we see in the outside world and bringing it to how we see this vis-a-vis the existence of nuclear weapons. It also references the first GA resolution, so on disarmament that the ambassador mentioned right now. So it's a pending task of the United Nations. If it was its first resolution talking about complete nuclear disarmament, and now we see 13,000 nuclear weapons and plans for building more, then the United Nations is also failing in reaching that goal of disarmament, its very first resolution. So it's reminding everybody that the TPNW is being held at the UN headquarters, and it's giving the message also to everybody that's there, we're not doing enough to move forward. Even though we as the TPNW states parties believe that we have advanced in that goal, but it's a reminder for others, right? Also trying to be reactive to the newest developments, artificial intelligence. So we hear even more about how artificial intelligence would make the military domain more effective, more everything great that they try to sell us. But when artificial intelligence is connected to nuclear weapons, what does this mean? Some of us were extremely concerned about this, so we pushed for a language that speaks directly in saying that so long as nuclear weapons are there and artificial intelligence is being developed, that we demand that those that have nuclear weapons do not relegate decision-making to others that are not human. Maybe some would have wanted to see something a little bit more powerful, but I think that statement in saying, while you have your nuclear weapons, we expect you to have command and control, is something that is current, relevant, and I think that everybody can understand, and I would think that everybody would be scared that decisions on nuclear weapons use would be relegated to artificial intelligence. And in seeing how the TPNW fits with a larger architecture, we were also being very clear about our expectations to other treaties. So the Non-Proliferation Treaty is going to have its major session next year. It's what we call the Super Bowl of the nuclear field, where you have the 5 recognized nuclear weapon states and everybody else trying to get agreements. We've lost trust in that process. There's no negotiation, there's no confidence. So we have signaled very clearly that we want to see progress in nuclear disarmament, we want to see trust rebuilt, and that these are our expectations, that we've done our part in advancing nuclear disarmament, but we expect this from the others. Other components of the architecture, the START treaty, the one that was negotiated between Russia and the United States to make sure that they would bring down their levels of nuclear warheads, but also missiles and other delivery systems across the Cold War. It's set to expire next year, and there's no negotiations between Russia and the United States on this. So also a powerful message saying, we expect you to negotiate and reduce weapons. Of course, we would like to see global zero, but for the moment, if there's no successor treaty to the START, then we are in a completely different field. So at least we expect you to reduce your arsenals. So as you see, we've been trying to make sure that that political declaration responds to everything. It's complicated at times because everybody wants to have their own interests reflected there. Some things are a little bit repetitive, but in other cases, we've gone a little bit beyond that. One also interesting thing that's beyond the political declaration, but in general terms about how the treaty is operating, that now we're not only talking about the science behind nuclear weapons or the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, but also the security concerns, what I was referring to as just the example of Mexico's vision of what we feel by being threatened by the existence of nuclear weapons. But to explain a little bit more in security terms to those that have nuclear weapons, what does it mean for the existence of nuclear weapons vis-a-vis those that do not have nuclear weapons, but not reducing it sometimes to these arguments that they like to dismiss very easily. If they want to talk only security, we will talk security back. So it's difficult to articulate everything in security terms, but that conjunction of humanitarian plus scientific plus security is something that is giving us a different kind of conversation. And for the choosing hope part, I think that what I would highlight is that the TPNW gives you a different narrative. It's not sticking to what we've known for many years, almost 80 years of the security dilemmas, the security ways and we approach the problems in the world. It's a way to be able to challenge the mainstream narratives and to be able to then give a different perspective. And not just to follow blindly what we've heard. And this is the opportunity to reach out to different communities, civil society, but also the youth. We think that the people that are right now in control of nuclear weapons, nuclear policy, have been using all of these concepts and constructs for many years. But the new generations are going to be the ones replacing them. So those new generations being able to understand different dilemmas, different angles, is the way to make change. Also, those that have been affected by nuclear weapons use and testing will be able to have a path towards nuclear justice. We're working on a possible trust fund on addressing the legacy of nuclear testing. This is something that doesn't happen elsewhere, but it's being able to choose that path for hope for those that have been affected. And in general, just being able to provide a forum to be critical about nuclear deterrence and not just stick to the normal arguments that we've seen. And at least we've not seen any other forum that works in that way for the moment. So I'm happy to answer also any other follow-on questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that helped us to understand more about the TPNW itself and what was discussed during the 3MSP. And then we found out that the TPNW itself is the hope that we have. Thank you very much. So the last panelist is Professor Harang. We'd like to know what were the Dr. Krieger and President Ikeda's idea toward the deterrence and their vision to create a peaceful world or a better world.
Thank you so much, Chie Sunada. And thank you so much, Soka Gakkai International. Thank you so much, Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, for doing this really important work of organizing this conference. I'm so happy to be here together with my wonderful students from Soka University of America and my dear colleagues from Soka University of America. I truly believe this is a significant conference. And of course, we started off with a blast yesterday, didn't we? With Annie Jacobsen and the distinguished panel. And of course, with global leaders of the movement, as we have here with Melissa Parkey, the executive director of Whyte, and legends like Richard Falk and several more. This is a blast. Just one tiny little comment before we start with the hope, because that's what I've been asked to talk about. As an educator, it's kind of important to send a message back to John and the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists and the Doomsday Clock, and as well as Annie Jacobsen, that these works that we've been presented to yesterday, the book by Annie Jacobsen and the Doomsday Clock, and also the Bulletin as such, these are also very important materials in my job as a professor. These are on our reading lists. This January, I actually bought a full class set of Annie Jacobsen's book. I never done that with any other book before. But then again, we never had a book like that before. We never had it. We never had a book that was so important to actually buy and put in your private bookshelf so it's available to you all the time. That's easy for me to say, who's a professor at the university, has taken a clear stance on nuclear weapons. We're against, if you wondered. It's part of our founding philosophy, so we know. So it's kind of easy at the university like that, but it's also important to remember, I do that with the Doomsday Clock every single year. Every single year when it's announced, I use it in my teachings. And, this is a resource for any other university as well. So, back to the remarks I've been asked to give on Krieger and Ikeda's vision for a better world. I think that it's natural to start up exactly where Dr. Ivana Hughes led us in her opening remarks, to the fact that Daisaku Ikeda and David Krieger dedicated their lives to the exact same cause as all of you, I believe, have committed yourself to by being here, which of course is the abolition of all nuclear weapons. Now, Krieger and Ikeda, they were true peace builders. And as Krieger founded NAPF back in 1982, Ikeda founded the university that I represent, Soka University of America, in 1987. Now, Ikeda was a Buddhist philosopher, educator, and the president of Soka Gakkai International. Together with the founder of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, he shares a common vision that emphasizes dialogue, education, and grassroots activism as essential tools for achieving lasting peace. Krieger and Ikeda's work intersects at the fundamental belief that a peaceful world built on human dignity, mutual understanding, and the elimination of all nuclear weapons. And David Krieger and Daisaku Ikeda's vision for peace is a testament to the power of dialogue, the power of education, and the power of grassroots activism. Their tireless efforts to promote nuclear disarmament serve as a call to action for individuals as well as nations. And as we witness here today, by fostering a culture of peace that prioritizes human dignity and international cooperation, their work continues to inspire generations to work towards a future free of nuclear weapons. Daisaku Ikeda's philosophy of peace is deeply rooted in Buddhist principles, particularly the concept of interconnectedness and respect for the dignity of life. Now, his efforts in peace building emphasize the importance of dialogue, education, and cultural exchange as means to foster understanding and cooperation among nations as well as individuals. One of Ikeda's major contributions is his annual peace proposals, which he presented to the United Nations from 1983 to 2022. Now, all of them propose practical steps towards a world free of nuclear weapons. And in this context, I think it's important to mention that IKEDA continuously emphasized the role of youth in shaping a more peaceful future, advocating for a global movement that inspires young people to take an active role in creating change through dialogue, as well as the importance of nuclear disarmament education. Now, David Krieger's work was largely focused on nuclear disarmament and the abolition of nuclear weapons, of course. As a founder of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, he has been a vocal advocate for global treaties aimed at eliminating nuclear weapons and ensuring a safer world. But Krieger wrote extensively on the moral and existential dangers posed by nuclear weapons, arguing that their existence threatens the very fabric of human civilization. And this is also a connection point that I believe really fostered a very deep friendship between these two leaders. Krieger's vision aligns with IKEDA's in that he too believes that the power of dialogue is essential. He worked tirelessly to raise awareness about the catastrophic consequences of nuclear war and has called for world leaders to commit to complete disarmament. His advocacy has included collaborations with international organizations, with policymakers, and grassroots movements to push for agreements on nuclear disarmament and the establishment of nuclear weapon-free zones. Now, both IKEDA and Krieger emphasize the necessity of a cultural shift in how humanity perceives war and peace. They argue that peace is not simply a diplomatic or political issue, but it's a deeply human one. And that requires transformation of consciousness. Their shared belief in the power of individuals to effect change underscores the importance of grassroots movements in achieving a nuclear-free world. In this endeavor, education is key. As IKEDA has promoted value-creating education that nurtures wisdom, courage, and compassion, Krieger has worked to inform the public about the dangers of nuclear weapons and the moral responsibility that we all bear to abolish them. And lastly, I consider every single one of you here to be peace leaders, and therefore I would like to share some insights from this fantastic book, Choose Hope, the dialogue between IKEDA and Krieger. Now, chapter 4 there is especially relevant to you, I think, because that is called Peace Leadership. So, here's a quote for you. Krieger says, "All authentic peace movements are committed to long-term efforts. After all, peace is a process that must continually be renewed. Opposing the forces of violence embedded in current national systems and in relations between nations requires courage and long-term commitment." Then IKEDA replies, "To bear fruit, a peace movement absolutely requires clear vision and leaders of unshakable convictions and passion. I consider it important for leaders to be imbued with a willingness to lay down their lives for their ideals. As history teaches, movements whose leaders lose their resolve stagnate and ultimately decline. In contrast, though it may take time, movements ultimately attain their goals as long as their leaders' minds are aflame with their convictions." Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much for sharing the spirit of both David Krieger and Daisaku Ikeda that bring us all hope. Now I would like to invite all the panelists to respond to other panelists. If anyone would like to raise any questions or comment to other panelists. Anyone? Oh, would you like to? Okay.
I just remembered that I didn't answer your question about deterrence. There's let me just make sure that everybody gets this, because you know this is on Ivada's reading list for you all. She's been mentioning that, so that's true soap. So there's a subtitle in there, which is called The Myth of Deterrence. I think that's quite interesting. Myth. This stagnant view, if I just scare you enough, then you won't hit me, will you? I believe that's part of the essence here. That we all know that life is continuous change. Why should the state of deterrence be any different? Now the problem, as I'm researching nuclear disarmament, the potential use and all these things over many, many years, is that it's hard not to see that deterrence always deteriorates. It always deteriorates because it's a static mindset that brings the key arguments. And that static mindset is simply not connected to real life experience, real life development. So I think that's a key message that is also central under that headline.
Yeah, additional comment? Is this working? Okay, thank you very much for that additional comment. If there are any response or questions, okay, Eduardo.
Maybe not a question or a response, but just in the lead up to the treaty, I think that the ambassador also had to experience a lot of pressure from the nuclear armed states, which were boycotting the conference. So it was not only the countries that were convinced about promoting the treaty, but also the boycott that was being felt, that they didn't attend, but that they had also delegations inside that were trying to make it a little bit more difficult for the rest to be able to negotiate the treaty. And with those odds, we still, I think, came out in the end with a good treaty. Again, I think I need to stress that no treaty is perfect, but I think that given all of those circumstances, whatever was at stake, that negotiation was especially difficult in that regard. But yeah, maybe if you can tell us how you were managing to resist that pressure, I would like to hear it from the President.
Well, you will be surprised to hear that I received the mandate to be the president of the conference. I could not anticipate that. I knew that there was opposition by the nuclear weapon states, but I could not make that my official position. So I just requested meetings with them. And I talked to all of them. Oh, it's obvious, right? Because I was the mandate holder of a mandate or decision of the General Assembly. And I think one of the lessons that I learned as a diplomat was precisely how you talk to other counterparts that have a completely different view of what you're talking about. And we still had a conversation on tea. Around tea, and they were saying in very respectful manners why they didn't agree about the drafts. I do recall one conversation that I had. So I had like 2 rounds of conversations with them, one before and another one once I had released the first draft. And I remember one of them saying, "Oh, our worst nightmares have become true with that draft." But it was in a normal diplomatic environment that we just talk in the framework of respectful conversations. Well, I did have some conversations were tougher than others, that's for sure. But I did not only talk to the P5s, but also to other countries. Japan was in a very difficult position, obviously. I did also have conversations with them. And then everything else was just driven by what was happening in the room. They whatever was happening in the room, if the P5, well, not all of them, but 3 of the P5 delivered this press conference in the moment when we were inaugurating the conference outside of the assembly hall. with other members of NATO. And, but I had talked to them. It's something that I think that came out during my conversations with them. It was their concern about what our intentions were with the NPT. But the mandate in the resolution was very clear that the TPNW had to reinforce the existing architecture, and that means the NPT, the CTBT, no, no acronyms, that it had to reinforce non-proliferation, the prohibition of testing, that is in the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, the CTBT, and also the Nuclear Weapon-Free Zone treaties. So we, in the drafting process, needed to make sure that we made reference to those obligations, that we were actually reinforcing those obligations so that we included another value added. And the second point I would like to mention is that maybe I forgot in the previous, in my previous remarks, is that in this part of what was going on in the rest of the international community and in multilateralism to have to move away from state-centric approaches to everything, be them development or in this case security, towards a concern towards human beings and environment, human people and planet. That actually started in 1992 with the Rio Conference on Sustainable Development, and then we saw this transformation of almost every single topic in the world agenda shifted towards a concern of, about people and planet. Development before the 90s was conceived, remember, as a process of increased GDP, increased production. And then after the 90s, we saw the birth of the concept of first human development and then sustainable development. Human development then was conceptualized as a process of entitlement of people's capabilities. And so we saw then the creation of the concept of human security, putting the emphasis again on the structural causes of conflict and looking at the human being, not only of the state as the object of our security concerns. And that obviously was also inspiring the movement towards having a ban on anti-personal landmines, to have a ban on cluster munitions because of the impact they had, because of the indiscriminate nature of the impact that didn't distinguish between civilians and combatants. And also the creation of the International Criminal Court. There was part of that big movement towards filling some gaps that had been left in the international agenda in the during the Cold War. So it was only a matter of time for this human-centered approach to step in the conversation of nuclear weapons. But something that was very important in the millennium, new millennium, is that the leaders of the movement, nuclear disarmament movement, understood first and foremost that nuclear weapons were not separate from the rest of the agenda of the international community. They are linked in their perspectives, in their impact, but also in perspective with human rights, with development, with all international law. And also that means that the leaders also thought that other problems, to look at other problems, very entrenched problems of the international community had in different periods, like colonization, slavery, apartheid, all of these problems that were very entrenched in specific moments in history that were very related to the power structure of the moment as nuclear weapons are today. For instance, slavery was the basic of the power structure of the 17th, 18th century. And for all of those problems, they realized that having a norm that delegitimizes the behavior or the weapon had played a role in shaping the human understanding of that behavior of that weapon, and it had been a fundamental process in leading towards towards the evolution. So I think that was one of the reasons why they thought at some point, well, maybe we can separate the prohibition norm so that we have better impact in delegitimizing nuclear weapons and in actually having a counter narrative to the dominant narrative of nuclear deterrence. And they saw the value in separating the prohibition norm from the moment in which there is going to be abolition. I think that is also fundamental to understand why moving towards a prohibition treaty, because before the efforts were towards discussing a nuclear weapons convention. They had everything together. Prohibition, abolition, and everything, but that was not possible to move forward because of the opposition of the nuclear nations.
Thank you very much. I thought you have some kind of magic to make it was possible, but then you emphasize the importance of dialogue. Even we have a different and a completely different idea. So I think that was something that we should keep in mind always in working in a disarmament.
I think especially in 2025, it is very important to bring, and I'd like to share that experience because being a diplomat from Costa Rica, it is very obvious what our historic tradition has been in terms of how we frame our policy or positions towards disarmament, deterrence, everything. But just the fact that I requested a meeting with those who opposed and they received me in their offices. This is just what is diplomacy about. We talk. And we talk in the framework of a diplomatic perspective, which is we exchange ideas and express dissent in a respectful manner, and just that's what diplomacy is about, and I think we just have to bring it back to the table today in 2025.
Yes. Thank you very much for sharing the very important points. I know we already passed our time, but is this okay to take some question from the participant? Just one question? Oh, two. Okay, from the... okay, yes, please. Yes.
Thank you. Tremendous. So I'm a member of Veterans for Peace. We are...
Sorry, could you introduce yourself and who you want to ask question? Thank you.
My name is Elayne. I'm representative of Veterans for Peace, international organization of veterans that started in the United States. So my question is, we have an NGO status at the United Nations, and I'm wondering, do you have any recommendations for NGOs like us or other members of civil society, how we can either try to influence members of the United Nations countries to consider and adopt this treaty, or what else we can do in our community to do that? Now, we have a peace boat called the Golden Rule that we've had for 10 years that's sailed all over, and our main goal is to talk about the dangers of nuclear war, nuclear weapons. But what else might we do with the United Nations? That's my first question. The second question is, if I may real quick, one of the great treaties of the last century was the Calabrian Treaty that outlawed war as an instrument of national policy. That sort of fell through the cracks, and my understanding is that one of the failings is that there was no enforcement mechanism. That is, countries that violated the treaty, there was no consequences for that. And I'm wondering, are there consequences for nations who may adopt this treaty, but then because of their security concerns, decide, oh, well, I think we need to build nuclear weapons? How does the treaty handle those people who may violate the treaty? Thank you.
Okay, because of the time, maybe we can take all the question. Another question from the Professor Richard Hook.
I'm Richard Fall. I thank the panel very much for articulating so clearly the security, the changes generating an alternative narrative. I think those are very important contributions. But I think I would raise what you might consider a skeptical question, and that is, how do you distinguish choosing hope from wishful thinking? Because it's quite striking that the nuclear clock moves closer to zero while you describe these positive developments. So it seems to me that sustainable hope has to rest on some foundation of political realism and to involve strategies for dealing with the obstacles to attaining nuclear disarmament. And among those obstacles, one is in the UN framework, the fact that the 5 most developed nuclear powers all have been given from the outset a veto. That seems to accord primacy to geopolitics and to subordinate the rule of law, the rule of morality, and subordinate it to geopolitical ambition. And the second thing I would just briefly allude to is what Eisenhower long ago called the military-industrial complex. Unless one has strategies to deal with the nuclear establishment that is extremely powerful in the leading nuclear countries, especially this one, it does make one feel that there is a wishful thinking component that isn't matched by political strategies. And anyone who has the motivation to
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the question. I would like to take the last question.
First on Eisenhower's military-industrial complex, he knew about it because he created it. He knew about the military-industrial complex when he created it. He was president when he was elected. We had 1,000 nuclear weapons. When he left office, we had 22,000 nuclear weapons. When his budgeting cycle was finished, he had 30,000 nuclear weapons, as I'm sure you know. But my question, John, you talked about the debate between going to 89 seconds and 88 seconds, and that being symbolically a neo-Nazi Heil Hitler symbol. Why not 80 seconds? That doesn't represent any neo-Nazi symbol that I know of. Because I think when you think of all the points you made, I think that plus the fact that Biden had given Ukraine permission to use the ACMs to attack inside Russia. Russia lowered its nuclear doctrine in response. That plus the Gaza war continuing more threats against Iran. China heating up with General Mike Minihan, U.S. general, saying he thought the U.S. and China would be at war by 2025. You put that all together with articles in the bulletin, the August 20th article by Alcibiades saying that we have a lot of nuclear planners, or some nuclear planners, who think we can win a nuclear war. The same day that David Sanger had a piece in the New York Times saying that we're planning to fight a 3-front nuclear war against Russia, China, and North Korea simultaneously. When I put that all together, I think we should have, I was surprised that the clock only moved 1 second rather than 5 or 10 or however many. And Elayne, first I said this whole panel was fabulous, and everybody was excellent. But Elayne, when I think you talked about the scientists briefing Reagan and Gorbachev, and that somehow leading to Reykjavik, we were talking last night about Trump's statement calling for abolishing or dramatically cutting the nuclear arsenal and talking about the dangers of destroying life on the planet 50 or 100 times over. Well, now, I don't think of Trump as somebody who understands nuclear winter, but do you think that there's the same possibility if Reagan could move to nuclear abolition almost at Reykjavik? Is it possible that Trump and Putin could negotiate a serious kind of nuclear arsenal? And Eduardo, we'd like to give Texas back to you. You know, you said we stole half of the country for you. That's why I give deterrence, if you like it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for the old question. I think we have almost 5 questions, so four, five. So, Harang, which question would you like to take? Okay, what the civil society can do to impact the UN?
Yes, first to Barry, the Veterans for Peace. There's a whole new process, UN process, coming this year and next year. L39, that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the first committee resolution that was passed, the second Friday of November, about the scientific the inputs to the UN agencies. Let's just make it simple. That's what it's about. On the scientific basis when it comes to the consequences of use. That should be ideal for Veterans for Peace to contribute directly. This UN process starts now, very shortly, with a 10-day meeting in New York. I can't remember the dates right now. Is it May or June? Well, it's coming up very soon. That's an excellent opportunity for you to engage directly. And you don't need more than your ECOSOC status to play in there. So I think that's the first big one that comes. And to the wishful thinking, Richard Falk. There, how do you distinguish from choosing hope from wishful thinking? In the case of the military-industrial complex, I have a proposition for all of you. In this country, when we have the deterrence meeting, usually in January, you get all the industry gathered at once, together with a part of academia that is on the side of the industry here, the deterrence studies field, together with those hawks among the politicians that is deeply invested in the military industry, specifically on the nuclear side. So now we've had these annual summits for a while, and we can see participants list of huge, big donors to politics and everything. And up until now, it seems to me like they have been able to hold their summit just for themselves. Why don't we invite ourselves? They need to talk to us. We need to talk to them. And there are big money, there are big political influence that is gathered there in those rooms. So why don't we show up there? Why don't we engage in dialogue with them? I think that is number one. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The next question to John. Why 1 second, 89 seconds.
You have been good to be in the room when everybody was arguing about what the clock should move. And, this year, usually there's somebody who wants to move it away from midnight. There's nobody arguing for that. And there were suggestions of, I think, 1 or 2 even closer than 80. So what you say is perfectly reasonable. The world can be seen as even more dangerous than the statement I helped them write says, and actually I kind of believe that, but this is a consensus document of our board. They are leading experts, and part of the reason they moved it only 1 second had to do with, everybody wanted to go, oh my God, Donald Trump is coming into office. And yeah, that was talked about a lot, but the board felt it wrong to change the clock based on something that might happen because he's kind of an unstable person. But, you know, when the clock announcement was made, he'd been in office again only like 8 days. So he had announced some crazy stuff, but he hadn't done anything that, you know, would change the clock. So that was kind of the 1 second was, but we're going to be watching Donald Trump very closely next year.
Thank you for your response. Eduardo, would you like to make additional comment or respond to other questions?
Yeah, maybe very briefly. On the first question about Veterans for Peace and their engagement, I would say keep on pushing. It's not the same when you hear or you have engagement with veterans from a country that has nuclear weapons rather than from diplomats from countries that don't have it. We usually are presented with this picture of a monolithic nuclear weapons state that everybody from the government to the armed forces to the people are supporting nuclear weapons, which is not the case. So having those voices that think differently is something that I think changes also the dynamic. On the question on the military-industrial complex, I think that this is the key part also in changing the narrative. A lot of people that work in just fabricating parts or components and like that never understand what the end product would be and what they're contributing to. It's very easy to just work on technical aspects and, you know, new technology, new defense, whatever, but it doesn't really trickle down to what this weapon would do in terms of humanitarian consequences or such. So I think that is a key, but there needs to be also targeted aspects to that. And on the question of the veto and the power structure, not only do I do disarmament, but I also am in charge of Security Council reform at the UN. So that conversation is especially important because it's an outdated power structure from 1945. The fact that the P5 have also nuclear weapons has also built into this narrative that, oh, they are there because they have nuclear weapons. That was not the case in 1945. The US was developing nuclear weapons, but they didn't have them. And they imposed on themselves those privileges rather than being really granted with them. But I think that right now, in the power struggle that we're seeing, the conversation on UN reform and Security Council reform is more important than ever, and to de-link the idea of the veto with nuclear weapons, which I think is a very skewed conversation that some like to push forward.
No comment on the Texas.
Not only Texas, but California.
Sorry, I was joking. So that's response from the ambassador.
Yes, I would like to address the previous question about the potential role of scientists, perhaps influence of having a conversation with the current leadership. That I understand part of what unfolded in the 80s is that there was a communication process between scientists in the US and in the Soviet Union that actually was the one that led to these discoveries, joint efforts, research efforts that actually generated a new thinking that had an influence on the leaders that then started the arms control and the drastic reduction of nuclear weapons. I do think that in this moment we also need to complement the current mandate of the General Assembly to update the study on the impact of nuclear weapons, also of nuclear war, also contemplates, if I'm not mistaken, the socio-economic impact. And I think we need more economists thinking about the issue of nuclear weapons and investment of nuclear weapons in terms of not only of development and justice in the world, but in terms of competitiveness for the nations that have to make those investments. So I think that would be very interesting to have economists giving their input to this study, or independent studies that I think, in this case, President Trump being a business person, that maybe it would be interesting for him to see a study of that sort, because precisely he's been addressing the issue of the resources that need to be allocated to keep up with the modernization program of nuclear weapons. And last but not least, I would like to just to make a very brief reference to the issue of wishful thinking. And I have to say that I have thought about this. This is a very profound question about how social change comes about in reality, how societies move from one expression to a different one, and how we relate to the different industrial revolutions and the power structure that comes with the different industrial revolutions. And I think at the bottom of that question, there is yet another question, which is, do values and norms actually shape reality, right? And I think that they do. Values and norms do shape the perception and the thinking of actors in society. And at some point, social change meets new thinking and new paradigms. I think the difference between wishful thinking and actual change is also a matter of time and intelligent, organized, and strategic action. When you were posing the question, I was thinking about, I don't know, Nelson Mandela or all the independence fighters in Africa, or all the leaders that fought for the abolition of slavery that, as I mentioned before, was absolutely inherent in the power structure in the world of 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. Nobody could think of an economic order without slavery, right? And how that actually also came to an end because the Industrial Revolution had an impact in generating demand for labor, but also because there were the norms already that had been shaping the way in which society thought about enslaving groups of people, enslaving other humans. So I think that change is systemic and is complex in the sense that it's composed of many different interacting elements. And I think the norms do have an impact in shaping society.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the insightful remarks and excellent questions. With this, I'd like to conclude this panel. Please join me expressing my gratitude and appreciation for the excellent panelists and all the participation. Thank you very much.